Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and I'm joined tonight by Jason Ortiz, who's been on the show several times.
That's right.
And he's involved in a lot of different equity organizations in Connecticut, and maybe out of Connecticut a little bit as well. So we're going to talk about the legislative agenda in Connecticut and also about some national issues that need attention. So welcome, Jason.
Thank you so much for having me yet again.
Yeah, I think the first time was maybe around 2007.
Yeah, maybe. It's gotten to be a good, check-in for me at the beginning of the legislature. We can see what issues are popping up and to get ready for the year of activism.
So one thing, that I know is a huge issue for both of us, and we kind of met over drug policy.
Yeah, that's right.
In 2005 and 6 when Cliff Thornton was running for governor. So I guess we can kind of start with that. Last year, there were a couple different bills before the legislature for legalization of recreational cannabis. They varied in quality and, to say the least, and nothing really passed. So maybe we can start with that issue. What does this year bring?
Sure. So last year we did have 3 different bills that did pass a committee, but they never made it to the full floor. And so we had lots of conversations on different details, but I think the difference this year is we're coming with a full 118-page bill right from the beginning, pushed by the governor's office. And so there is one conversation to be having and one thing that we're looking at to amend, and it is quite different. It does include a number of the things that we saw discussed last year. That does include creation of an equity commission that has its pros and cons. And so the gist of it is it will say that Connecticut does support the legalization of marijuana, of cannabis, but it will make all the regulations determined by the Department of Consumer Protection and this equity commission that will be created. And so those 2 entities, and DCP, the Department of Consumer Protection, currently runs the medical marijuana system. Those 2 entities will offer regulations in 2021. The legislature will then debate and approve those regulations, and then licensing can begin after that. So we won't even see an application window until at least mid next year at this point. So it does kick the can down the road a bit, but it does include a number of details as far as what type of licenses we will have, whether it'll be dispensaries. There are licenses in there for delivery services and social consumption lounges, which is something we don't see in a lot of other states yet, which would be a good way for Connecticut to move forward. And it does not include, however, things like home grow for patients or for anyone. That is included in a study that they will also produce much later. It does also discuss taxation of the plan.
Of course, because, really, sometimes these progressive pushes kind of boil down to money.
Right, yes, it does.
Like
often.
It's a revenue stream.
Sure. Yeah, and so, but this one is a little bit odd in how they run. It's very Connecticut, I say, how they try to tax it, because they're taxing it at many different levels at the supply chain. And so there is, a 3.5%, $3.50 tax per gram of cannabis. So an ounce is 28 grams, right? It's going to be $30 or $40 per ounce and upwards if you start to go higher amounts. And so, but there are also taxes that happen at the point of manufacturing, where folks are selling their raw materials to the manufacturers. That there will also be a tax at that point. So how the percentages sort of all shake out into, is it going to be 20%, 30%? I still have to do all the calculations there, but it will be on par, I think, with Massachusetts. And we are making sure that Connecticut's space is, appropriate between New York and Massachusetts. We have a competitive rate, but hopefully, if we can get this at least a little bit more details, we can beat New York to the punch. Where it's definitely lacking, however, is in the criminal justice side of it. There's very little protections for folks currently incarcerated. There's some strong equity expungement provisions that I think will be helpful, and there's actually a specific bill just on expungements of not just cannabis records, but it adds cannabis to a number of programs. So the expungement piece is there, but folks that are currently in prison for selling marijuana, I don't think they're going to get much relief under this current bill.
And they won't be the ones getting business licenses.
Right. Well, and that's where we'll see what this equity commission develops. But then there's also the issues of labor issues within the industry. And this is one that maybe wasn't at the forefront of discussions last year that I think will be a hotter topic this year, right? Whether having a unionized workforce will be part of your application process is possible, where it'll be mandated from the beginning, right? That as soon as you become open for business, you will be unionized, and how that works out. And then also different amounts of equity provisions as far as employment goes. Who can open up in a Hartford or New London and they have to employ 30% local folks, things like that, right? So those details will also be getting worked out over the next few months. And hopefully we can get ourselves at least to a bill that folks can move forward on. And I think this bill does advance the conversation quite a bit. Now we'll find out where the real sticking points are.
So one of the groups that you're associated with is the Minority Cannabis Business Association.
That's right. I'm the president now, actually.
Oh,
yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I think last time I was on the show, I was vice president, maybe a couple shows before that, just a policy chair. So I think I got the green team bump that got me to president.
Hey, that's great. And really, you've been really on top of this topic probably for at least 15 years.
Sure, yeah, since I was arrested in high school.
That was probably not their intent to turn you into an activist for life.
Right, and so that's why I tell folks, I have to tell, sort of my origin story a lot, that, I got involved in the industry or the movement when I was impacted by the criminal justice system and arrested. This was in Norwich, Connecticut in 2001, and so I was suspended for 45 school days, so it was over 3 months, and it was school days, so every time there was a snowstorm, in Connecticut they have lots of snow days, it would continuously push my start date back. And so if you ever want to make a high school kid depressed, just suspend him for the entire winter in Connecticut and say you don't get any time with your friends or your school or your teachers. So it was not a great situation. I also got to see the criminal justice system firsthand and go to court. And it was a lot more folks that had skin much darker than mine that were there. And that was when I definitely saw that the laws not only being disproportionate as far as penalizing folks for very slight crimes, but it was just incredibly racist in both its intent and its impact. And then I was an activist ever since I saw that, and I've been trying to figure out both how folks like me that were in high school don't have to go through the same situation, but now being part of the industry and actually helping folks start businesses and writing regulations around business development, how do we make sure that the communities that were over-policed join in on all of the benefits and the revenue that are going to come from legalization? And so I've seen the industry replicate and double down on a lot of the racist practices of the criminal justice system. So while it is slightly nicer tone of what we're discussing, a lot of the problems are the same.
And there are different models in different states. We visit the Pacific Northwest every year.
It's a little different over there.
And it is a little different over there. I don't know anything about how, what their equity, what their criminal justice allowances are. But one thing we can't help but notice when we're in Oregon is that the dispensaries are very decentralized. Salem, Oregon, which is a city about the same size as Stamford or Bridgeport, has about 30 dispensaries. Little. Some are little. You can look them up on Yelp to see which ones are the good ones.
Sure, that's how you know we made it.
So it's quite different compared to someplace like Massachusetts. Just has a few superstores.
Yeah, and I think so. Over there, what they did is they were much more lenient in their licensing. And so both to be a cultivator, to open up a shop, to be in any part of the industry, licensing was just much easier. And so what you saw was lots of folks that were in the unregulated market flip over much quicker into the regulated market because it was easier. Where in Massachusetts, it's incredibly difficult to get a license. And if you do get one, it's many years after you've started the process. And so what that created, though, it's a controlled market for the folks that do get those licenses. And so the licensing process and how equitable and fair that process itself is determines everything else in the industry. And so that's why Oregon, you see a much more prolific small business community and just more jobs created. The problem, though, is cannabis in its unregulated form never stayed in any one state, right? And so the cannabis grown in California and in Oregon came to the East Coast, right? And so that is not what we're seeing with state-run programs. So if you grow cannabis in Oregon, you can't ship it to Connecticut, right? And so Oregon can grow substantially more and better and cheaper products than it could ever consume in Oregon.
Yeah, that's true. And the one of the interesting things about Oregon also is the kinds of regulations that are really helpful. My brother-in-law recently retired from working for the Department of Agriculture there, and the first year of legal recreational cannabis, over half the crop was thrown away, was destroyed due to high fungicide levels.
Yeah, right, for sure.
So,
Yep.
you know, I think when we think about what kind of regulation any drug industry needs, we want to make sure the product is safe and clean.
Sure,
And,
sure.
and you're getting what you think you're getting.
And I think it's important in those regulations that we're not over-regulating, because what we're seeing is a high number of fungicides, not necessarily fungus, right? And so if we say, for instance, certain levels of fungus that are allowed in the plant are not correlated to the scientific actual harm it could cause, right? You can over-regulate the plant, which means they're going to put a bunch of pesticides and fungicides on the plant for nothing, and then have to destroy it all. So we see the, you know, Monsanto big boxing of cannabis, where it's like you have to grow these specific strains that get this amount of pesticides, right? Where the cannabis grown in Oregon, you know, prior to legalization, nobody was dying from fungus poisoning, right? And so it's been interesting to see regulation at a time of sort of intellectual, I don't know, like lack of curiosity, right? I don't know the word there, but it's, we're regulating based on emotion, so folks want to make sure it's super, super safe, and that the regulations don't match how we actually produce the plant and the products.
Well, I think partly in time, when there's more outdoor growing and less indoor growing, fungus might be less of an issue. Fungus, you know, it is funny when you say fungicides, you know, use is kind of funny in Oregon because their summers are very dry.
Right, yeah.
All but the very coastal areas, summers are dry. And so the fact that the growers were using so much fungicide that the crop needed to be thrown away is really odd. But I wonder how much of that was grown indoors.
Right, a lot of it probably, especially legal. It all has to be grown indoors, I believe, as far as the legal cannabis goes. And so, but that is when, you know, a regulator can't be making that decision, right? Like you can't have your state rep deciding the level of fungus that's going to be allowable in a product, because they just don't know, right? And so they're going to take whatever people tell them, and if you put that limit far too low, similar to the situation of hemp and THC, right? And so with hemp, you have to have a certain top end of THC allowed in the plant. If it goes over that, you have to throw it all out. Right, and so hemp produces THC as part of its life cycle, right? And so also if you harvest and then let it sit, if it starts to decompose and the water evaporates out, the THC level goes up, right? So, but if it's 0.01, like if it's a tiny, tiny percentage and you have it go up, you know, 1%, and now you got to throw your whole crop away, that's not actually preventing harm, right? That's not preventing anyone. That's not helping anyone stay safer. It's just an abstract metric that doesn't match the situation. And so I'm a little worried that's how things get, you know, worked out in this industry right now. And it's not really based on as much science as I would hope. But it is at least we can learn from Oregon, and we can learn from other states that are making these decisions and, you know, change things to make sure that Connecticut's legal system is much better. And one of those things is interstate commerce, right? Are we going to allow imports and exports of products? Because we can avoid what happened in Oregon, right, where they had an overproduction because they couldn't export it, by allowing us to export. And so if you allow Connecticut farmers and Connecticut manufacturers and all this to export to, say, the New York City market, right? Like, it's a tremendous opportunity there. But we have to be upfront and, you know, progressive about this, and not just do, you know, whatever the folks did last time.
And of course, some of the interstate stuff is dependent on federal law as well.
For sure.
So, but you mentioned growing, and, you know, it's always seemed really odd to me that you can't grow plants. I mean, you can grow.
Right, it's that simple.
I mean, I can grow, you know, like castor bean or digitalis flowers or monkshood. I can grow things in my yard that will kill you if you eat them, and people don't eat them because, you know, they don't want to die. But so to have some, it's always seemed to me that, you know, there are farmers markets and vegetables grown. So anyone who grows tomatoes in their garden or whatever, they can grow it.
Yeah.
There's no regulation. They can give it to their friends.
Sure.
No regulation. If they go to farmers markets or try to sell it, then some regulations kick in. If they try to make some value-added products out of
Sure.
it, regulation kicks in.
Yep.
But for just the plant in small quantities for your use and your friends'
Right.
use,
Yeah.
it seems like we already kind of have a model for
Sure.
other farm products that is sort of appropriate in this case as well.
Sure, yeah, and I think the cannabis plant hits on all sorts of different levels. So not only are we not allowing folks to do something that's clearly safe, but we are allowing corporations to do it in the terms of tens of thousands of pounds. So it's not untested either, right? That we say, oh, cannabis is dangerous. It's like, well, we're currently producing thousands of pounds of it and selling it to patients in a legal manufactured situation. So how can we continue to think that it's going to be more dangerous than nuclear waste when we're already doing it? Right, like it's already happening. Massachusetts is already doing it, and so I still just don't understand why people are so afraid of something like home grow, right? Just growing plants in your house, when it is like the most American thing you can do is to grow your own food in your own property and be able to grow whatever you want to grow. And so I'm not sure, and I think that's again where it's like it's not really about the science of it. Right, it's about the emotion of it, and for whatever reason, that is still carrying the day. Because not only are we not able to just grow what we want, the amount of health benefits and personal decisions that you can make with this plant to benefit your life are tremendous. And so I think it's just as much emotional and economic as it is science, unfortunately.
I think you're right. And now, how does the whole industrial hemp industry fit into this whole thing?
So again, partly because we take a non-scientific approach, we've like really separated hemp and full THC cannabis into like two completely different worlds. And it's like hemp is fine, but as soon as it starts being fun, then it's illegal, right? And so hemp, though, we have hemp creation and hemp growth happening in Connecticut right now. And so there are licensed hemp growers in Connecticut. A good friend of mine, Lou Vega, was one of the folks that was part of Cure CT, Connecticut United for Reform and Equity, which is one of the groups I work with. That's our Connecticut-based equity group. He was somebody that got a hemp license immediately, was able to work with MCBA to get an investment grant from our I2 Accelerator program through Merida Capital. And so MCBA was able to get $500,000, $500,000, split between 5 businesses to have some investment capital put in, and Lou was one of those people. And so he was able to buy processing equipment in order to process the hemp into CBD-rich oil. So that came in real handy when the price of hemp dropped, right? And so there was so much production that a pound of hemp was losing its value very quickly, and they had to process it. And so those folks that didn't have processing equipment, their whole hemp crop maybe wasn't that profitable for them. And so we saw that happen across the country. There were folks that made lots of money and some folks that made next to nothing. But it was generally to fuel the CBD product industry.
So we're not talking about the fiber industry or the construction industry?
Not yet. I think there are a lot of R&D projects. So like Levi's recently came out with that they now have a way to turn hemp into what feels like cotton-based jeans, right? And so that sort of products are coming. But no, for the most part, it was in all of the lotions and pills and things you saw in gas stations and all this, which personally I don't put a whole lot of stock into the veracity of the claims on a lot of these products.
Sure.
Like the guy that works at the gas station is not a pharmacist, right? He's not able to tell you what's actually in those products. But at the higher dose levels, at the research levels, that is happening. And so that is something that is clearly an advancement, right? There are, I think it was the University of Louisiana came out recently with their own CBD product line that they're going to start to do research on. So we are seeing baby steps on the hemp side as far as research goes and being able to open up what it could possibly do. But for the most part, it was sort of for these value-added products that came out with CBD in them.
Okay, yeah, one of the reasons I thought about hemp is that I recently learned that the clothing and fashion industry are like the biggest polluters on the planet. Yeah. And there are people who are looking at both locally grown wool and hemp to help get out of the synthetic
Sure.
petrochemical fabric business.
Yeah.
And even like the very polluting chemically cotton
Sure.
processing.
And hemp can actually pull the toxins out of the ground that those other products put in there. And so it's a remediative crop, right? Like if you plant it somewhere, it would actually make your soil better.
So let's see. We talked about. So what do you see as maybe passing this year in the legislature, and what should people do to support the right kind of legislation?
So actually here in New London, you all need to contact your state representatives because New London has 2 of the no votes as far as legalization goes. And so both State Rep Anthony Nolan and State Rep Joe De La Cruz are both not the biggest fan on this particular issue. So you could swing the whole vote right here in New London and get those 2 folks down. And so we should be looking to, and we are working with some of your city council members to host a forum here in New London, specifically at the Senior Center and Senior Issues. And so we'll be having those conversations in the near future. I think that's going to be a really important part of this for the local communities to have conversations locally. What does legalization look like for New London? Right? Because New London can decide, does it want to have retail? Does it want to have manufacturing? Does it want to have other forms of business? Do we want to set up business incubators for young people that want to join the industry? So there's lots of possibilities that can happen there. And the more towns we have that are ready for this and have gone through the discussions, the stronger any bill is going to be at the state capitol. And so I do think what's going to happen is by the end of the session, DCP will have to come back with more specific regulations. That unfortunately means we're just going to have this fight again in a year. But the Equity Commission will also be in effect, and who gets on that Equity Commission is another very important question, right? And so making sure someone from New London or from the southeastern Connecticut area is here will help to guarantee that New London gets a piece of the pie, and that's going to be very important. And so I do think, though, having those discussions with DCP and the Equity Commission is better than the legislature, right? Like the folks that will be on that commission at least are focused on that particular issue, have some kind of expertise, hopefully, right? Like we never know with appointments how much expertise folks have, but it's better than 150 state reps having the conversation all at the same time. And so I think it is a step forward, but if you're someone that wants to get into the industry, right, like definitely check out MCBA and start to think about what you would like to do specifically. Are you someone that is baking home products, right? And you know how to make cookies or candy. You already work with a place like Click Willimantic that is a cooperatively licensed kitchen, right? And so being able to figure out those products, if you're somebody that is an agricultural person, right? Like learning what it takes to grow hemp or to grow indoors, like there's lots of setup that folks can do. But I always say, start a business now, form your LLC now, that's doing a similar thing than you would want to do in the cannabis industry, just without cannabis. And so if you want to be a cultivator, start cultivating other plants, right? If you want to be someone that manufactures products, start making them without THC, and on and on and on. And I think that's how folks can get ready for it, because one way or another, it's going to happen either this year or next year.
And there are a couple of locations in New London that have, our zoning regs were changed a few years ago to allow medical dispensaries in New London in commercial zones. Pretty much anywhere there's a pharmacy permitted, you could have a medical dispensary. Planning and zoning has not yet talked about, recreational. Dispensaries, because when we changed the regulation, the state wasn't there yet. It wasn't really an issue. I don't know exactly how it will go. I'm guessing, New London is always looking for
Well, I think
for revenue,
and
businesses and ways to bring people in.
Sure, and I think this is the perfect issue to have that conversation because there's so many possibilities. Like if New London wanted to set aside some of its area on, manufacturing. Right? There is an infinite amount of products that could be created there and businesses that would want to create those products that could get shipped first all over Connecticut, but then throughout the world once it's legal. And there is no place that has that. I always say, like, my dream in the cannabis industry would be to have sort of Charlie's Chocolate Factory, right, of cannabis products, because you can do any different thing you could possibly think of. But whether or not New London wants to have a social consumption space, right, where folks can gather and consume, and it could be the same as you would see in any bar like the Social or any of those other places on Bank Street, but it would be a brand new place for folks to gather. You could hold events there, you could bring in music, you could do lots of different things, right? Or does New London say, we don't want to have any retail, but we want to support delivery businesses? If you want to deliver throughout the state of Connecticut, that's perfectly fine. You can incorporate here in New London. But maybe we don't want any storefronts, right? And so there's so many different ways we can do that, both in carrots and sticks, right? We can say we don't want big business, but we do want smaller businesses. And what resources are we going to ask from the state in order for equity initiatives as well? So New London, regardless of the industry, right? So even if you don't decide to have any cannabis businesses, there are communities in New London that were over-policed when it came to marijuana enforcement, without a doubt, right? You could take some start from the top of New London down, you can probably figure it out.
That was my origin story.
Oh, really?
Sort of, yeah. I worked for Head Start, and I was a home visitor, so I had a caseload of 12 kids. And the last year I worked for Head Start, 4 of the 12 kids had incarcerated parents. And 3 out of the 4, both parents were incarcerated, and they were virtual orphans who were being bounced around, different relatives. DCF was involved in theory, but no one was really looking after the kids. And it was just about then that I met Cliff Thornton. Like, oh yeah, there's a pattern here.
Well, some of those kids maybe could start businesses here in New London, right? And so it could change their lives if we empower those folks.
Yeah, this was 15 years ago, so
they're probably right around the right age,
Yeah, they're in their mid to late 20s now.
But I think in those communities, whether they participate directly in the industry or not, should receive funds to help undo the damage done by the over-policing. Because when you target a community, and specifically when it comes to marijuana, it's not just the possession, it's the distribution, right? And a lot of breadwinners, folks that are bringing home money for their families, that's an economic crime, right? Like they are making money off something that's not supposed to be made money off of. When you target a community in an economic sense, you're going to destroy that community's ability to generate wealth, to employ itself, to raise each other up. And so we have to admit that that was done specifically and then use the revenue generated to heal that damage. What that looks like for New London can only be decided by the people in New London. And so having that conversation with the people of New London, right, what does reinvestment in our communities look like? Is it we want a community center? Is we want these houses to be fixed? Is it there were people that were gentrified out of whole communities that are now no longer there? How do we heal that damage? Is it through our schools? Do we just agree as a community that we want to really invest in our schools, or say infrastructure, right? Maybe it has to do with water and making sure that all students don't have lead in their water, right? There's a lot of different ways that folks can look at it, but those conversations need to happen before the legalization happens, or we'll be too late. And I do think, though, you have a city council right now that is in a good position to have those conversations.
Yeah, I think so too. Now, you listed a lot of points, a lot of forms that the reparations can take that are not just paying a paycheck to every household. Do you get a feel, with your time in Hartford, what our legislators are thinking?
Different legislators definitely think different things, and some of it is more from a place of moral clarity, and some of it is about wanting to get political wins, but I will take good ideas however they get finished, right? And so I think there have been conversations of how to have a broader community approach to the reinvestment, right? Who gets to determine where it goes is where it all gets a bit mucky, right? And so people will think, maybe the city council gets to decide, or the mayor, or the school board, or what have you, and you can, see where that goes. But for the most part, I think the idea that we need to heal the damage done by the war on drugs has won the day in Hartford. I think the vast majority of state reps, at least on the Democratic side, and even some on the Republican side, they may not vote for it, but they'll say you're right about the history of it, will admit that that is clear. The data is clear, the arrest records are clear, the specific communities are clear, and so how is where we get divided, right, of how we should do it, right? And also it's a bit tricky in the state capitol just as far as dedicating funds to particular things. There's also the leadership always wants everything to just go in the general fund. And that's where we had this whole transportation lockbox conversation, right? And so there's also the like process problems with that, right? Where we can't just do that. We can't pass a law that says 17% go here and 5% goes here. That's not how it's going to happen. But we can create the Office of Justice Reinvestment, or some office that is specifically charged with the reinvestment dollars, and fund that department. That we can do. And so we need the legislature and the governor to make that a priority. That should be a recommendation out of the Equity Commission. I will recommend to them that they do that, see if they listen to me. But I think there are ways to get it done, and folks want to do it. It's just, getting the sausage made is quite a process, as they say.
Yeah. It shouldn't have to be so complicated, I don't think, but just our history and the just muddiness all around the subject that's has made it harder.
And the war on drugs has affected so many different facets of our lives that now we have to go back and fix all the problems that have been made over the last 100 years. And so we ruined our education system by putting more police in schools. We've devastated communities by denying them the health benefits of this plant and using pharmaceutical medications that have done untold damage, right? We've neglected our research sector. Now the rest of the world is light years ahead of us in medicine and production. And so for every way that the war on drugs damaged our lives, we have to come up with policies to fix it. And I think folks are just now realizing how bad it really was when you have to actually clean up the mess.
Wow. Well, so moving on, I think, to a little different subject, but there are some related issues. You are also part of the Connecticut Puerto Rican agenda, which is part of a national
The National Puerto Rican Agenda, yep.
So can you talk about that organization
Sure.
and what your role is?
Sure. And so I'm the outgoing president, but I'm still on the National Board of Directors for the National Puerto Rican Agenda. But I mean, Puerto Rico is another one that has many different issues going on at the same time. And so I originally got involved, I'll say, to address Promesa, which was a bill that created a undemocratic, in my opinion, fiscal control board over Puerto Rico. I actually have one of those in Hartford now too. Fancy that, but Hartford's not as democratic as I'd like it to be either.
So who gets to appoint these boards?
The governor. Well, in this sense, Congress appoints the board of the Fiscal Control Board in Puerto Rico, not Puerto Ricans in any way, shape, or form, right? And so the president, now that we've switched presidents, the current president gets to appoint, but all of the appointments have been pretty much terrible. But from Democrat, Republican, whoever it is, they tended to be folks in the banking sector that helped to create the debt that caused the economic collapse in Puerto Rico. And so it's definitely a fox in charge of the henhouse situation. So that's what pulled me in originally. Then I started to do a lot of work on the coal ash dumping that was happening throughout the island. So there was actually a Virginia-based energy company, AES, Applied Energy Systems, that was burning coal all around the country and dumping the ash in Puerto Rico. And so there was such a problem with where they could put it because it was toxic waste and you can't just dump it anywhere, that they actually got the EPA to change the classification to basic garbage, meaning that you could dump it anywhere you could dump garbage. So what they did was they took that and they dumped it in the landfills. But if you dump toxic waste in the landfills, the rain that goes through all of this is going to seep it all out. And that was making poisonous residue all over the place. People were getting really upset. So they stopped doing that and just started piling it up. And so there was actually a 10-story tall pile of coal ash where there's a road that a truck takes to go to the top of the pile, right? So it can hold a road with a truck on it. That's how big it is. And the worst part is if you're standing right next to the coal ash pile, because I actually went there and I got to see it, it's pretty ridiculous, and you turn 180 degrees, there's solar panels right behind it, right behind a fence, so and owned by the same company, right? And so I was doing that work when Hurricane Maria happened, right? And so the hurricane not only did devastated lots of things, but you can imagine if you have a pile of ash the size of a building and a hurricane hits it, where's all that ash going to go? And so for me, I was starting on one issue and then learning more and more how everything was being interconnected. there's no way you could think about Puerto Rico not talk about climate change, right? And then there's like the political situation where it is still a colony. It's been a colony for 500 years. And so our ability to make decisions on the island is severely limited. We were not allowed to accept outside help from other countries after the hurricane because the United States controls our waters. So Puerto Rico has natural disasters that are happening on top of political disasters that are happening on top of man-made economic disasters. And so being a Puerto Rican right now is very complicated and has a lot of things going on. But at the same time, we saw an unprecedented upswell of activity from grassroots movements that ousted the governor. And so I feel like over the last 2 years, and I was also fortunate enough to be there when that happened in Puerto Rico. And so I've seen over the last 2 years both like the lowest moments that I've felt as a Puerto Rican and also the strongest moments of pride when I saw folks from all different sectors of society working together to oust the governor. And so it has been a wild last couple years in the position with the agenda because we've had to address all of those things at the same time while still ensuring we do talk about the issues relevant to Puerto Ricans here. And so it's been a lot of coordination. It's been a lot of disaster relief work. It's been a lot of also making sure I'm staying in contact with my friends and family that are over there at the same time as I am trying to merge my two worlds by actually getting a cultivation license for cannabis in Puerto Rico. Because sadly, or I don't know if sadly is the right word, but there's more opportunities for that in Puerto Rico than there is in Connecticut because they have a much more open perspective on the marijuana industry in Puerto Rico than we do here in Connecticut. There's not as much protectionism as there is here from the pharmaceutical industry. So, as I try to build a future there and figure out what the next step is, I'm seeing political and climate chaos on the island in ways, I just never thought were possible before, I got to see it firsthand.
So, post Maria, have things been put back to what they were environmentally?
Right. Well, it's hard to say because it was pretty terrible before the hurricane. So it's like, were they put back to broken? Like, yeah, like it was broken before the hurricane, and there wasn't a whole lot of protections then either. I think what's different now, no, it's not rebuilt better or as it was before, but the people are stronger and the people are more independent-minded. The people are just more able to trust each other because they had to, right? Like the necessity of cooperation in that moment now made things like independence seem more possible. And so I don't think anything has changed politically as far as the government being more responsive or the U.S. actually investing in it. We're still fighting over the disaster aid from 2 years ago, right? And just now, they say released or what, like, who knows? And so the problems have continued. I think the internet has allowed Puerto Ricans to reach the world with their problems and really highlight just how ridiculous the situation is over there. But I don't think the U.S. government or the folks here have learned any lessons from what has happened.
No, I think even most, liberal Americans think, it needs to be a state. Right. And this past summer...
And often with good intentions.
Yeah. This past summer at the National Green Party meeting, there were a few individuals from the group, the Ocho, who made a film, Colonization is Extinction.
Yes,
which I have a copy of, which it's out on loan. Yeah. But one thing really struck me about the economy there when you talked about the coal ash dumping, that a lot of how Puerto Rico has been treated by American industry is not that different from how low status U.S. cities have been treated. Yeah. And the whole idea of opportunity zones that kind of gave the inroad to wealthy, businesses from outside coming and building in the community, but not really being of the community is something that we kind of see stateside as well, and trying to figure out how to make sure there's really a local benefit and not a predatory relationship is really difficult.
Yeah, I've always said that Puerto Rico has been in a toxic relationship with its last two partners, both the United States and Spain, for a long time, and are just currently dealing with the ramifications of 100 years of Stockholm Syndrome as a community. And so there are a lot of folks that think just becoming a state will solve a lot of our problems. And I always, very quickly point out what happened in New Orleans, right? And so New Orleans, Louisiana is a state of the United States. And it was clear that our government did not care about the people in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And so if we look at places like Baltimore or Flint, Michigan, right, that were dealing with intense social issues and just complete neglect, right? Like the issues with water in Flint are 100% just criminal neglect. And so...
And I recently read that there are many cities around the country that their water is similarly lead infected.
Absolutely. And so statehood is not answer to much of everything, because as the answer to being in a toxic relationship is not to get married, right? Like our relationship with the United States has been toxic from day one. It's been exploitive, not just in an industry sense, coming and poisoning the island, the military using Vieques as a bombing site so they can test their bombs where people live. It goes on and on what the United States has done to the people of Puerto Rico. And I think we need to understand all of that in context when we decide whether it's going to make sense for us to be our own country or not. Culturally, Puerto Ricans are different. We have our own flag, we have our own food, our own music, and in a lot of ways, both English and Spanish, right, is 100% Puerto Rican culture. And it's very clear that some folks in the United States would be very upset with that, of having Spanish be one of our main languages. And so I think morally, it does not make sense for us to make our imprisonment and exploitation permanent, right? Like right now, it is an issue that needs to be resolved, so there's hope for independence and hope for a better way and a new way. And I also think that Puerto Rico as its own nation in modern times has the ability to, for instance, be 100% renewable energy independent. It has the access to the technology. It has a small enough geographic area and small enough population that it could be tested and looked at to see what is possible. And it's a little bit smaller in population than Connecticut, but it's spread out around the edges a little bit more. And so I think Puerto Rico has so much opportunity. Same thing with the cannabis industry. Puerto Rico could do all kinds of things that Connecticut doesn't want to do and have access to the Caribbean market, South America, Latin America, and over to Europe.
Probably a really good growing climate.
It is one of the best, and that's partly why I'm getting my cultivation license there. It's true, though, that like as the ridiculousness of prohibition ends, places that currently grow agricultural products are going to put all the other places out of business, right? Like we don't grow avocados in Connecticut. We buy our avocados from Central America. And it's the same thing that's going to happen with every other product, right? Like we buy our potatoes a lot from Idaho because they're really good at growing potatoes over there. We don't grow them everywhere. And that's what's going to happen with Puerto Rico if and when we can be allowed to actually make those decisions, right? I think at this point, both the major political parties of the middle and right, I'll say, right, like that are in Puerto Rico have shown they're incapable of helping the people, dealing with much of anything. And so this year right now, they're having their next election. And so whether or not folks will change the way they vote and vote for somebody new it remains to be seen. Unfortunately, a lot of the folks my age left the island. And so there's a big gap of anyone between 30 and 60. So that means it's going to lean very older as far as the vote goes. But we are seeing some really insurgent third-party bids. And so Alexandra Lugaro, she started a new party, Victoria Ciudadana, so it's like the Citizens of Victory Party. And then there's also the Independence Party is also pushing folks at all different levels, state, senate, state reps, the equivalents. And so those two can really come and try to change the conversation. And we're going to be having that conversation at the same time as we're having the U.S. conversation. And so how politics shake out on the island after Maria, after the ousting of Rosselló, after we find out again recently that there was all these supplies left behind from Maria. So it's a very energized and charged moment right now in Puerto Rican politics. And for me, I see that as opportunity, right? Like we can take that moment and really envision what Puerto Rico is going to look like. And I think the most independent, the strongest Puerto Rico is one that isn't still in a toxic relationship with the United States.
Now, I think you would have a much better answer to this than anything I can imagine. You grew up here. and
born in New London, raised back in Lawrence Memorial, way back when it was called that.
Yeah, so a lot of people have families that are split between the West Mainland and Puerto Rico. So even under independence, would it be complicated to retain free movement between the two places?
I think it depends who's in charge of our immigration system on that one, whether or not we decide Puerto Rico is a welcome country or not, right? I think the citizenship question is one that comes up a lot, so I definitely want to address that in that you will retain whatever citizenship you have now, right? So anyone that is currently a U.S. citizen will not lose their citizenship, right? So far, when you're born here, you retain that citizenship, right? And they haven't changed it yet.
They keep talking
right,
about
exactly.
it,
That's
which
what
is
I mean.
actually kind of scary.
Right, and it could happen retroactively where they do it to Puerto Ricans. That's something Trump would do. So elections do matter, but barring any significant change, you will not lose your citizenship. So if you're a family that's currently split, and just about everybody in Puerto Rico will remain an American citizen, they would then be allowed to, depending on how the revolution goes, right? But either have a dual citizenship, they could come here and come live in the United States. They could live in Puerto Rico as an American citizen, as folks will continue to do, as just like we have American citizens all over the world. And so there's not like the day after the revolution happens, everybody loses their passport, right? It's going to be which is the first baby born after a new government takes over. That's where the question is going to be, right? That will be the first Puerto Rican citizen. Although I think there's actually technically like 80 Puerto Rican citizens that have their own thing, but that's a different conversation. But that's when citizenship will matter. And so for split families, like I have a split family. My sister grew up on the island with my grandparents. There will be very little change as far as legal status for folks. Whether or not the United States decides to be incredibly racist in its immigration policy after that,
which
I can't.
Is not unthinkable.
right, exactly. And so, I think there are plenty of folks that don't even understand what Puerto Rico is in relation to the United States that are sitting Congress people. And so, we'll see. The thing is that there are very prominent Puerto Ricans, both in Congress and in the media and in culture. So I don't think we're completely defenseless here when it comes to determining how the U.S. feels about Puerto Rico. But it is a question of colonialism, and that is not an easy question to resolve in any capacity. But once you start to talk about things like equity and reparations, right, what the United States owes to Puerto Rico for what they've done to it, what does the United States owe to all of Latin America for the war on drugs? At this point, equity
which
continues for sure, and its relations to our immigration issues, right? So what the conversation currently on equity is about very hyper-local equity, right? Folks that were arrested in this town should get some help opening a business like in this state, right? But what the United States did to the entirety of Latin and South America is going to be a conversation that is going to be another one that we have to have, and we have to address it. And I'm glad that I'm part of MCBA, where we have a Latino that is president now that can address that. And we are actually pushing on the federal level, quick plug, to pass a bill that would remove cannabis offenses from being a deportable offense. And so it's actually one of the top ways people are deported in this country.
Cannabis offenses are deportable?
A deportable offense, yeah. Simple possession will get you kicked out of the country. And actually working in the legal market is a deportable offense. And so, so if you're in Colorado and you're a bud tender and you're paying your bills, and then they can deport you for that. And so that is a question, right, that I would love to have that debate with Trump, and we'll see how he decides to approach that one. But I know where I stand on it. I know MCBA is going to be pushing those issues, that it's not just the hyper-local equity conversation. We also have to start talking international and global and what the United States owes to Latin America for its clear war on the people of Latin America.
Now, in the 4 minutes we have left, what would you recommend to viewers if they want to get involved or make sure some of these issues are addressed, either statewide or...
Sure, yeah. I think definitely if you're in Connecticut, follow CureCT. That's curect.org, curect.org. That's our local equity organization. There's a lot of analysis of last year's bills in there, so you'll be able to see that. But really, we need you all to contact your state representatives. That's the number one thing.
And in New London, which is a place that has been very impacted by the war.
Oh,
on drugs.
absolutely, for sure. And I will say, there are votes to be swung in this district. So New London could lead the way on finally being the tipping point on this issue. And so please contact your folks, contact your city council too, and zoning and Board of Ed to decide how are they going to push for legalization in 2020.
Yeah, well, I don't know if a resolution would be quite the right thing, but in the last minute, I'll tell you that the Representative Nolan did approach me and said, what does the Green Party want to think about? And I said, well, we haven't really sat down yet, but off the top of my head, legalization, and figure out what equity would look
Sure,
like.
yeah. So New London can pass an equity ordinance preemptively. So New London can say, this is how we want to do it. And New London can actually set the stage and the conversation for all the other towns in Connecticut if they do that. Hartford had some conversations last year, but right now you can say, we want one retail outlet, one social consumption lounge, and we want 51% of the people employed to be New London residents. Like, if y'all can get that conversation on paper, you'll be helping to push the rest of the state in the right direction.
And I'm thinking New London and like Willimantic and Hartford and New Haven and Bridgeport.
Yep.
And there are probably at least 10 towns in Connecticut that have very similar needs and histories.
And I think we could, I don't know if this would be something that would pass to the state capitol, but we could have a pilot program where only those 10 cities were allowed to sell cannabis to start. And so now we guarantee that all the economic activity will go directly to those places. And if those suburban towns that don't want it, they don't have to have it, right? But let those 10 towns get the head start. Sure, exactly. We'll take it, right? And so if they don't want it, let the top 10 towns that have suffered from the war on drugs be the ones to produce every single cannabis product that will sell to the rest of the world. And I think it's a win-win for everybody. We'll see if they let us pull something like that off at the Capitol. But here in New London, y'all can ask to get at the front of the line.
Well, I think we're out of time now. But yes, thanks, Jason, for coming on and talking about our state agenda, but also some international stuff too.
Absolutely, thank you.
So
pleasure as always.
Yeah. So. For the rest of you, next week we won't be live. Dr. Kathy Hermes did a program last week on Africans, African Americans, and natives buried in the ancient burial ground in Hartford that we videotaped, and we'll be showing that.
Wow.
So it was good.
Taking on the soft topics next week.
and who knows, whenever you want to come back, come on back, mid-session or whatever.
And when we pass it.
Yeah, we'll see you all next week.
Sounds good.